For centuries, Rome has stood as the epicenter of spiritual power, a city built on layered history, faith, and perhaps most profoundly, secrets. We are drawn instinctively to the magnificent facade of St. Peter's Basilica, to the familiar silhouette of the Vatican, yet it is what lies beneath the surface, within the cold stone walls of the Apostolic Palace, that defines the true scope of this ancient empire. We speak of the Vatican Apostolic Archive, formerly known worldwide by its more evocative, more terrifying name, the Vatican Secret Archives. Imagine not merely a library, but a repository of historical memory so vast, so intentionally obscured, that its very existence functions as a mechanism of global control. It is a place where time itself seems to slow, where the pressurized atmosphere preserves not only parchment and vellum, but the very fabric of suppressed truth. What if the most powerful religious institution in the history of the Western world was not merely guarding its own theological doctrines, but actively concealing a history so shattering, so fundamentally contradictory to its foundational narrative, that its public release would fracture the established reality of human origin? This is the question that haunts the edges of established academia, a question whispered in the dimly lit halls of certain universities and aggressively dismissed in the daylight of mainstream discourse. What if the Church, the heir to thousands of years of compiled knowledge, holds within its deepest vaults not just the letters of kings and popes, but the indisputable record of non-terrestrial interaction? Our journey begins not with faith, but with heresy, the persistent, compelling narrative of the Annunaki. The name itself, derived from Sumerian mythology, means those who from heaven to earth came. For decades, alternative historians, fueled by the complex translations of cuneiform tablets, particularly those popularized by the late Zechariah Sitchin, have proposed a radical reinterpretation of human genesis. They suggest that the Anunnaki were not simply mythological deities, but highly advanced extraterrestrial beings who arrived on Earth, specifically in ancient Mesopotamia, tens of thousands of years ago. The accepted narrative of human evolution places the development of Homo sapiens as a relatively slow, natural process. But the Anunnaki theory posits a startling intervention. Driven by a desperate need for gold, a critical resource for their home planet, often identified as Nibiru, a hypothetical 12th planet in our solar system, these celestial visitors engineered humanity as a slave race, a genetically modified, compliant workforce built to extract the precious metal. This intervention, this fusion of terrestrial hominid DNA with advanced extraterrestrial genomics, is, according to this forbidden history, the true origin of what we call Adam and Eve, and the rapid, seemingly inexplicable leap in human intelligence that occurred in the Fertile Crescent. The Vatican, as the keeper of the Western world's spiritual and historical ledger, is acutely aware of the theological threat posed by such a narrative. The doctrine of the Immaculate Conception, the centrality of God as the sole creator, and the unique status of humanity as having been made in His image, are all jeopardized by the mere suggestion of genetic manipulation by advanced, non-divine beings. The implications are staggering. If humanity was created by the Anunnaki, then the entirety of Abrahamic religion is founded upon a misinterpretation or a deliberate obfuscation of a highly detailed historical record. Enter Elias Vance, a man whose professional career was built upon the solid bedrock of accepted archaeological theory, a specialist in Near Eastern studies at a prestigious New England university. For years, Vance scoffed at the ancient alien hypotheses, dismissing them as fringe fantasy, the domain of late-night cable television and overly imaginative enthusiasts. He found comfort in the tangible, the dated, the peer-reviewed certainty of carbon dating and stratigraphic analysis. His office smelled of old paper and stale coffee, a sanctuary of established facts. Yet a persistent thread began to snag at the edges of his research. An anomaly in the early Sumerian translations he was working on, texts that predated the established creation myths. These weren't straightforward worship hymns, they were accounts. Precise, almost scientific descriptions of the Shining Ones descending from the sky, wearing gear that sounded suspiciously like spacesuits, utilizing tools that defied the Bronze Age, and, most disturbingly, descriptions of genetic experimentation centers in the Mesopotamian Delta. Vance found himself trapped in a classic intellectual dilemma. To pursue this thread meant professional suicide, exile from the esteemed halls of conventional history. But to ignore it meant denying a historical inconsistency that was becoming too loud to ignore. He realized that the gap in our evolutionary history, the sudden appearance of sophisticated language, agriculture, and complex social structures in Sumer, was the very crack in the accepted paradigm that the Anunnaki narrative sought to fill. He started his investigation quietly, using his legitimate access to lesser-known European libraries, meticulously cross-referencing Sumerian pictograms with obscure early Christian Gnostic texts. He found frightening parallels. Texts long labeled as heretical by the Church described watchers and fallen angels in terms that mirrored the descriptions of the Anunnaki, beings who shared knowledge and technology with humanity, often against the express will of a higher, perhaps less immediately physical terrestrial entity. The whispers led him inevitably toward the source of the greatest historical censorship: Rome. The Vatican, Vance understood, didn't just happen upon these records. Throughout the early centuries of the Church, particularly following the collapse of the Western Roman Empire and the subsequent preservation efforts by monastic orders, the Church became the single largest collector and preserver of ancient manuscripts. When Roman legions swept across the Near East, they brought back not only plunder and slaves, but also the most valuable resource of all: knowledge. Thousands of clay tablets, scrolls from the Library of Alexandria, or copies thereof secreted away before the final destruction, and detailed records from ancient centers like Babylon and Ugarit, all filtered, catalogued, and ultimately judged by the nascent institution of the papacy. If there were detailed, unvarnished accounts of the Anunnaki's creation of humanity, accounts which directly contradicted the Genesis narrative that solidified papal authority, where would they go? Not on a bonfire. The Church has always understood that knowledge, even forbidden knowledge, is power. It would be secured, locked away, and guarded by layers of bureaucracy and theological justification. It would be placed in the Archivum Secretum Apostolicum. Vance arrived in Rome in the late autumn. The air was thick with the smell of wet stone and exhaust fumes, a modern scent layered over 2 millennia of history. He felt immediately under scrutiny, a paranoid sensation he dismissed as the natural psychological impact of being in the capital of hidden power. He wasn't seeking theological debate. He was seeking empirical evidence. He needed a key, a conduit, an opening into the labyrinth that few outside the highest ecclesiastical circles had ever navigated successfully. He had learned through an academic connection about a former curator of the archives, a man named Father Angelo Ricci. Ricci had been quietly, some say forcefully, retired 10 years prior, following a nervous breakdown attributed to overwork and theological strain. Vance suspected the strain was not merely academic. Ricci was rumored to have been working on a highly classified project concerning pre-Diluvian chronologies before his sudden exit. Finding Ricci was difficult. The Church excels at making people disappear into quiet suburban obscurity. After weeks of discreet inquiries, misleading travel logs, and careful avoidance of direct contact with the official Vatican historical departments, Vance located him in a small, unassuming villa outside Frascati, nestled in the Alban Hills. The contrast was stark. the intense, humid pressure of the Vatican replaced by the serene, almost oppressive quiet of the Italian countryside. Ricci was frail, his eyes shadowed by a decade of haunted reflection. He lived simply, surrounded by grapevines and the scent of rosemary, a man who had traded the suffocating grandeur of the apostolic palace for the stark clarity of exile. He was initially resistant to Vance, citing oaths of secrecy and the very real fear of institutional reprisal. "They do not forget, Professor Vance," Ricci whispered, his voice dry like ancient parchment. "The oaths are binding not just legally, but spiritually. To speak of what lies in the deposito is to invite a judgment far harsher than excommunication." Vance spent 3 days patiently engaging Ricci, not challenging him, but validating his fear, acknowledging the immense psychological burden of knowing something that fundamentally breaks the world. He spoke of the Sumerian texts, the consistent descriptions of the Dingir, the Annunaki, and the disturbing homogeneity of creation myths across vastly separated ancient cultures. Finally, on the 4th evening, as the shadows lengthened across the terraced vineyard and the air grew cool and damp, Ricci broke. He did not provide a key or a map or a hidden scroll. Instead, he provided context, the philosophical justification for the great concealment. "The issue is not that the Church doesn't believe in other beings," Ricci explained, pouring a thin red wine. "The issue is that those beings were not God." The archives contain not one, but multiple detailed accounts, primarily derived from cuneiform tablets translated by early Syriac scholars in the 5th century, confirming the Anunnaki's terrestrial presence. They confirm the genetic manipulation. They confirm the gold mining operation. But more importantly, they confirm the nature of the so-called original sin. Ricci described the forbidden documents as detailing a highly specific moment, when Enki and Enlil, 2 key Anunnaki figures, realized their engineered creation, Lulu Amelu, the primitive worker, had gained sentience and the ability to reproduce independently. The tree of knowledge was not a metaphorical apple, but the knowledge of self-determination, the realization that they were slaves. And the expulsion from Eden, the place of the biological laboratory, was the brutal, pragmatic response of the Anunnaki to prevent their workforce from becoming uncontrollable. The early church fathers, Ricci asserted, were faced with a dilemma. They had a functioning, growing religion based on the narrative of divine creation and redemption. To introduce the concept of alien geneticists would have shattered the entire structure of salvation, reducing God to merely one powerful being among others, or worse, reducing humanity to a failed experiment. "They chose order over truth, Professor," Ricci concluded, his hands shaking slightly. "They redacted history. They preserved the records, yes, but only to know the enemy and to ensure that the official narrative remained inviolate. They created a theological firewall." Ricci then whispered the name of the section where the most volatile documents were kept, not the main stacks of the archives, but a specialized high-security sub-vault known as Il Deposito Silenzioso, the silent repository. Access to it was restricted to only 4 cardinals, the Pope, and the archivist major. Vance felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool Italian night. He realized the sheer scale of the deception. This wasn't just about preserving dogma. It was about preserving civilization as we know it, built upon a carefully constructed lie. The Anunnaki were not just a myth. They were the ghost in the machine of history. This realization that the truth was locked away not in a dusty book, but woven into the political and spiritual authority of the world's oldest functioning monarchy, transformed Vance's investigation from an academic inquiry into a clandestine operation. He was no longer a historian. He was a silent aggressor against the established reality. He had to find a way into the silent repository. The cost, he knew, would be immense. The reward, however, was the complete and utter rewriting of human history. The weight of this knowledge pressed upon him, heavy and suffocating. He looked out over the darkened hills, imagining the vast hidden network of secrecy and preservation stretching back to the time of empires, all converging on the small sovereign state of the Vatican. He had the location, he had the context. Now he needed the method. The air crackled with unspoken urgency. What would be the necessary sacrifice to reveal a secret that the world's most formidable institution had guarded for 1700 years? If this beginning has already made you rethink everything you thought you knew about history, imagine what is coming next. So go ahead and leave your like and subscribe to the channel, because here, every video reveals something few have the courage to show. The architectural complexity of the Vatican is not accidental, it is deliberate, a physical manifestation of compartmentalized secrecy. Vance spent the next weeks immersed in ancient blueprints and modern security reports, legally and illegally obtained. He studied the labyrinthine layout of the Apostolic Palace, the Apostolic Library, and the connecting tunnels leading to the archives. He visualized the journey down into the Deposito Silencioso, a vault reportedly located 70 feet beneath the surface, shielded by multiple layers of reinforced concrete and protected by state-of-the-art surveillance systems layered over medieval defensive architecture. The sheer volume of material in the main archives is overwhelming. Estimated at over 53 miles of shelving, containing documents dating back to the 8th century, the task of merely identifying a specific relevant document is considered impossible without insider help. This is where Ricci's fragmented memory became invaluable. Ricci had referenced a specific collection code, a cipher used by the 5th century scholars who compiled the Syriac translations from the Sumerian originals. A code that Vance, through his expertise in obscure cuneiform cross-referencing, managed to decode. The code pointed not to a location, but to an entry criteria used in the indexing system. Only texts that described celestial architects not of the triune God were sequestered with this specific secondary classification marker. Vance realized he didn't need to navigate 53 miles of shelves. He needed to find the digital access point that filtered for that classification. Vance's operations shifted from scholarly inquiry to intelligence gathering. He rented a small, nondescript apartment near the Piazza Cavour, far enough from the Vatican to avoid immediate electronic surveillance, yet close enough to feel the presence of its colossal shadow. The apartment was sparse, illuminated mostly by the harsh glow of his laptop screen and the filtered light of Roman mornings. He had abandoned his tweed jackets and professional demeanor for anonymous street clothes, blending into the flow of tourists and local workers. The Annunaki, or Dingir, became his constant silent companions. He spent countless hours reviewing every available English and German translation of Sumerian epics, the Enuma Elish, the Epic of Gilgamesh, and the story of Adapa. He focused on the details often omitted or smoothed over in mainstream history, the detailed descriptions of sky mobiles, the water vessels, and the precise, almost technological terminology used to describe the creation of humankind. The consistent element in all these disparate texts was the description of the creators not as ethereal spirits, but as physical, mortal, though long-lived beings with hierarchical organizations, internal conflicts, and advanced material science. The mainstream academic world, Vance knew, justified these discrepancies through cultural lenses. They were metaphors, they argued, poetic expressions of cosmological wonder. But Vance, seeing the pattern now through Ricci's lens, saw a clear, deliberate effort to make the accounts mythological, thereby defanging their historical implications. Mythology is belief, history is evidence. The Vatican needed the Annunaki to remain belief. Vance began what he called the Whisper Campaign. Utilizing his established network in the historical community, he would introduce minor, seemingly innocuous questions during private academic discussions in Paris, London, and Berlin. Questions about the true origins of the pre-Sumerian Ubaid culture, or the unexplained metallic artifacts found in early Mesopotamian strata. He wasn't looking for answers. He was looking for reactions, specifically which individuals shut down the conversation fastest and which ones offered vague, highly scripted denials. He noticed a pattern of swift, almost immediate pushback originating from scholars who had received substantial grants or institutional support linked indirectly to Vatican foundations. This was the filtration system in action, a subtle but pervasive influence that ensured the perimeter of acceptable historical debate remained firmly closed around the established narrative. The intellectual air, Vance realized, was not free. It was carefully managed. One key incident solidified his suspicion. During a small symposium in Oxford on the dating of the Great Flood, Vance casually mentioned the possibility of localized, targeted genetic intervention in early human development, framing it as a hypothetical sociological model. The resulting silence was chilling. A highly respected professor of ancient history, Dr. Alistair Finch, a man known for his intellectual courage, visibly paled and quickly redirected the conversation to the merits of pottery shards. Later that evening, Finch cornered Vance, not in anger, but in fear. "Elias, you are crossing a line you cannot uncross," Finch warned, his voice barely audible above the pub chatter. "There are some questions that history is not meant to answer. Stay in your lane. Focus on the Assyrian conquests. The further back you look, the more dangerous the light becomes." Vance didn't need confirmation. He needed detail. He pressed Finch gently. "Dangerous to whom, Alistair? To the narrative or to the narrator?" Finch only shook his head, his eyes flickering nervously toward the exit. "Just stop, Elias. Just stop." The fear in Finch's eyes was more illuminating than any historical document. It confirmed that the secret was not merely institutional, it was actively enforced and known, at least vaguely, by a small cadre of academic custodians who had chosen self-preservation over historical honesty. Meanwhile, within the Apostolic Palace, the mechanism of suppression began to stir. Every movement Vance made, every contact he established, was meticulously recorded and analyzed. Leading this quiet, internal counter-operation was Cardinal Leonardo Bellini. Bellini was the quintessential Vatican man, educated in canon law at the Gregorian, fluent in 6 languages, possessing a chillingly calm demeanor, and serving as the prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith's Historical Commission, a body responsible for judging the historical accuracy of documents impacting church dogma. He was, effectively, the chief theological censor. Bellini did not merely believe in the Church. He was the Church's continuity, its institutional memory, and its most effective shield. Bellini sat in his opulent, high-ceilinged office, the air smelling of beeswax and old leather. On his antique mahogany desk lay a thin file marked simply Vance E. His movements were economical, his thought processes precise. He viewed Vance not as a heretic or a fool, but as a dangerous vector of intellectual instability. The historical truth of the Annunaki, Bellini believed, was not merely a threat to the Church, but a threat to the entire Western framework of ethics and governance. If people realized they were engineered slaves, the foundation of individual responsibility and spiritual pursuit would crumble, leading to anarchy. "Professor Vance is not interested in God, but in chaos," Bellini murmured to his subordinate Father Antonio, a nervous young archivist who handled the surveillance data. "He sees only the mechanism, not the necessary illusion. We must remind him that some truths are too corrosive for the light of day." Bellini instructed the monitoring of all of Vance's financial transactions and communication metadata. He did not want to eliminate Vance. That would create a martyr. He wanted to discredit him, to bury his research under a mountain of professional condemnation and fabricated evidence of instability. The same fate he had orchestrated for Father Ricci. If you have made it this far without hitting pause, it means this history has resonated deeply with you. Then strengthen this content, like the video now, and share it with someone who needs to see this hidden truth. Vance knew direct physical access to Il Deposito Silenzioso was impossible. His only chance lay in exploiting the complex, but inevitably flawed digital infrastructure that managed the vast catalogue of the archives. The Vatican, for all its medieval pomp, relies heavily on networked systems for cross-referencing and conservation tracking. He acquired highly specialized, commercially restricted software used by major libraries for deep-level digital archaeology, tools designed to reconstruct deleted or corrupted catalog entries. He was hunting for the phantom classification tag, the Syriac cipher indicating celestial architects. He spent 2 weeks mapping the Vatican's public-facing digital catalog, a deliberately sanitized and simplified version of the internal database. He analyzed the indexing anomalies, the inexplicable gaps in sequence, the sudden jumps in classification numbers that suggested entire blocks of documents were simply excised from the public record. The work was tedious, demanding, and utterly isolating. The Roman nights stretched long and cold. Vance subsisted on espresso and the relentless drive to pierce the historical veil. He felt the immense power of the church pushing back, not violently, but through a suffocating, systematic silence. Every time he hit a logical roadblock, he imagined Bellini's cool, condescending smile. Finally, 3 weeks into his digital excavation, he found it. Not a document itself, but a persistent ghost of a classification. A sequence of non-contiguous internal addresses linked by the Syriac cipher, pointing toward a document cluster tagged ASAI, Archivum Secretum Annunaki Implicationis. This cluster had been systematically removed from the primary index in the 17th century, likely during a major reorganization under Pope Paul V, but the residual metadata, the digital fossil, remained. The ghost files revealed the existence of 3 primary texts housed in the Deposito Silenzioso. 1. Codex Sephu, a 5th century Syriac translation of early Akkadian chronicles. 2. The Clay Ledger, a series of highly detailed drawings and geographical notations, possibly an Annunaki flight path map or resource assessment guide. 3. The Watcher's Account, a first-person narrative seemingly written by one of the fallen angels, or non-compliant Annunaki, detailing the ethical dilemma of manipulating the nascent human race. The most shocking realization was the volume. The metadata indicated that these documents were not brief summaries, but extensive, several hundred-page accounts, preserved on chemically treated vellum to withstand the centuries. Vance had confirmation. The forbidden knowledge was real, catalogued, and protected in the deepest subvault of the Vatican. He had managed to digitally verify the existence of the greatest secret in recorded history, but the digital record was only half the battle. How could he physically access and verify the content of Il Deposito Silenzioso? He needed an impossible insider, someone capable of breaching the highest level of security, and someone willing to risk eternal damnation for the sake of historical disclosure. The answer came from the most unlikely source, the nervous, subservient Father Antonio, Cardinal Bellini's young administrative assistant, the very man tasked with monitoring Vance. Antonio was a brilliant young Jesuit, burdened by a crisis of conscience. He had been a devout believer, but the constant surveillance, the systematic manipulation of historical records he witnessed daily, and the chilling, pragmatic atheism displayed by Cardinal Bellini when discussing the need for controlling the masses through comforting fictions had severely eroded his faith. Antonio had intercepted Vance's deep search query on the Vatican system and recognized the Syriac cipher. Unlike Bellini, who saw only disruption, Antonio saw vindication for his growing suspicion that the church was built on deliberate deceit. He knew the location of the ASAI files and the protocols for their occasional, highly secretive review. Antonio initiated contact through an encrypted disposable line using highly academic, obscure Latin phrases referencing the theological misinterpretation of the deluge. Vance recognized the language immediately, a direct reference to the content Ricci had discussed. They met in the dead of night, within a deserted, poorly maintained Baroque chapel on the outskirts of Rome. The air was cold, scented with mildew and stale incense. Antonio, dressed in a black cassock, looked like a frightened shadow. Vance was careful, observing the periphery, constantly checking for tailing vehicles or unexpected movement. "Professor Vance, I am risking my immortal soul and my mortal life by being here," Antonio stated, his voice trembling slightly but firm. "I need you to understand that what I am doing is not for academic gain, but because the suppression is the greater sin." Antonio explained the access architecture. The Deposito Silencioso utilized a rotating access schedule for the 4 oversight cardinals. Once every 6 months for a 48-hour window, the vault was opened for inventory audit and environmental control checks. Bellini was the key holder for the next scheduled review, which was due in 2 weeks. The physical barriers are impenetrable. Biometric scanners, coded entry, and a 24-hour armed Swiss Guard presence, Antonio detailed, leaning closer, the flickering oil lamp casting long, dramatic shadows. But the procedural security has a single fatal flaw: redundancy. Antonio had discovered that, during the physical audit, the 3 key documents, the Codex Sephu, the Clay Ledger, and the Watcher's account, were temporarily moved from the subvault to a secure reading room 1 level up in the archives proper. The move was necessitated by the need for specific conservation monitoring equipment that could not be permanently installed in the humidified subvault. That reading room, Antonio emphasized, is only protected by standard archive security, manual locks, motion sensors, and a single predictable night watchman who trusts the institutional security implicitly. The plan was audacious. Antonio would use his position to insert Vance into the archives on the night of the transfer, disguised as a conservation technician. Vance would have a narrow window, less than 2 hours, between the watchman's scheduled break and the arrival of the morning shift to photograph and digitally copy the documents. The ethical dilemma was crushing Vance. He was not a thief. He was a historian. Now he was committing espionage, risking a young man's life and potentially triggering an international incident. But the sheer magnitude of the truth at stake overpowered his moral resistance. This wasn't about stealing a painting, it was about reclaiming human history from its deliberate captors. Vance looked at Antonio, recognizing the deep pain of his internal conflict. "Father, why would you betray your oath for me, a stranger?" Antonio looked up, his eyes meeting Vance's, full of a strange mixture of terror and resolution. "I saw the contents of the Codex Sephu once, briefly, 3 years ago, before Bellini pulled me off the assignment. It described the creation of our consciousness, how they gave us the capacity for art, philosophy, and pain, knowing it would doom us simply to make us better laborers. It stated that the concept of God was merely a linguistic placeholder for the most powerful Dingir who remained after the others left. Professor Vance, if we are slaves created for gold, then the entire structure of sin and salvation is a fabrication to control the workforce. I cannot live knowing that. If this truth destroys the church, then the church deserved destruction for choosing the lie." The weight of their decision hung heavy in the chapel, the silence punctuated only by the distant chime of an unseen church bell, signaling the relentless march of time toward the point of no return. Vance spent the next 10 days preparing with surgical precision. He obtained sophisticated, silent, high-resolution photographic equipment small enough to be concealed within a custom-made belt lining. He studied the floor plans Antonio provided, memorizing the locations of every guard station, every security camera, and every squeaky floorboard in the reading room sector. Antonio provided the necessary identification badge, cloned from a legitimate technician, and the uniform, plain grey coveralls meant to be invisible in the labyrinth of the archive's maintenance areas. The uniform smelled faintly of ozone and industrial cleaner. Vance found himself reflecting on the historical parallels. He felt like an early Gnostic, attempting to retrieve the gnosis, true knowledge, that the orthodox powers had aggressively suppressed. This secret, this Annunaki history, was the ultimate gnosis, the truth of human identity. He realized the scale of the Vatican's institutional paranoia. They guarded this information not just because it contradicted doctrine, but because the methods of the Annunaki, genetic manipulation, rapid technological advancement, planetary resource extraction, were still highly sensitive concepts in the modern geopolitical world. The secret was both historical and contemporary. If you have navigated this far into the shadows of history without feeling the need to look away, it is because this story demands attention. Don't let this knowledge fade into silence. Like this video now, and share this narrative with someone whose eyes need to be opened. The day of the transfer arrived. It was a cold, foggy Thursday in December. The air within Vatican City felt dense, muffled by the low ceiling of cloud cover. Vance, positioned in his small apartment, meticulously checked his equipment. He felt an intense, focused calm, the kind of stillness that precedes a critical, irreversible action. Antonio, meanwhile, was performing his duties with a manufactured normalcy, moving through the Vatican's corridors with a sickening smile fixed to his face, all while the knowledge of his impending betrayal churned in his stomach. He personally oversaw the logistical preparation for the high-security audit. He watched Cardinal Bellini, the prefect of the commission, sign the final transfer orders for the 3 ASAI texts, his signature a flourish of arrogant power. Bellini, typically impervious, seemed unusually tense. He had received faint anomalous reports from the monitoring system regarding deep search queries, a ghost of Vance's digital fingerprint, but he dismissed it as harmless academic curiosity bumping against the digital walls. He was arrogant enough to believe that physical security was his absolute protection. At 11:45 p.m., Antonio, claiming an urgent need for electrical systems maintenance near the main research annex, ushered Vance, disguised and carrying a large, innocuous-looking toolbox, through a secondary service entrance. The air inside the archives was cold, dry, and heavy with the scent of chemicals used for pest control and preservation. Every sound echoed unnervingly off the high stone ceilings. Vance moved slowly, silently, guided by Antonio's whispered directions and his own memorized maps. The stone floors were polished smooth by centuries of clerical shoes, reflecting the dim emergency lights. They passed rows upon rows of sealed ancient cabinets, a physical testament to the accumulated, often devastating power of human thought and suppression. They reached the reading room annex, a cluster of modern, climate-controlled rooms inserted into the medieval structure. The security level here was visibly reduced, relying more on the belief that nothing truly important would ever be placed in an auxiliary space. "The texts are inside this room, Professor," Antonio whispered, his breath shallow. "Transferred an hour ago. The watchman, Cesare, takes his break at 1 a.m. You have until 2:30 a.m. before the shift changes." Antonio used his administrative clearance to disarm the outer magnetic lock on the annex door. He handed Vance a small, specialized lock-picking device for the internal room door, a necessary tool as Antonio's electronic key did not extend to that high-security inner chamber. "Go, Professor. May whatever God is real guide you." Vance nodded, placed a hand briefly on Antonio's shoulder, a silent promise of shared destiny, and slipped into the annex, pulling the door quietly shut behind him, leaving Antonio alone in the silent, intimidating corridor, trembling with the weight of his treason. Vance found the specific reading room, AR-404, and efficiently disabled the antique tumbler lock. He slipped inside. The room was clinical, bathed in the cool, sterile light of conservation lamps. And there they were, placed reverently on a large, felt-covered central table, protected by a thin layer of UV-filtering plexiglass. 3 objects that contained the annihilation of history as the world knew it. The Codex Sefu was thick, bound in dark, cracked leather, its pages glowing faintly yellow under the conservation lights. The clay ledger was a collection of meticulously preserved dark orange tablets, each inscribed with precise cuneiform and cartographic markings that seemed alien in their specificity. And finally, the Watcher's account, a series of scrolls carefully unrolled and weighted down. Vance's hands shook, not from fear, but from the realization that he was the first secular modern historian to witness these texts in centuries. The air felt charged, as if the immense weight of the suppressed history was radiating outward from the documents themselves. He quickly set up his miniature photographic array, beginning the arduous process of documenting every page, every glyph, every diagram. The Codex Sefu detailed not only the genetic process, describing how the Anunnaki utilized the DNA of local hominids, Homo erectus variants, and fused it with their own, creating the Lulu worker, but also the immediate, agonizing realization by the resulting human hybrid that they were, in fact, artificial. He focused the lens on a specific page that Antonio had mentioned, the description of the Garden of Eden, not a paradise, but a highly controlled, bioengineered enclosure, a testing facility where the worker race was cultivated and monitored. The expulsion was not punishment, but a quarantine action when the hybrids demonstrated self-awareness and potential for violence against their creators. This was not God's wrath, it was resource management. And the Vatican had known this fundamental truth for millennia. Vance worked with the speed of a man racing against an invisible clock. Every click of the tiny silenced shutter was a hammer blow against the walls of institutional secrecy. The temperature in the room was regulated to a precise 68 degrees Fahrenheit, yet Vance felt cold sweat beading on his forehead. He imagined the vast silence of the archives around him, miles of forgotten stories, all subservient to the 3 damning artifacts on his table. He moved on to the Watcher's account. This was perhaps the most emotionally potent document. It was a first-hand narrative, believed by Syriac scholars to have been transcribed from an older pre-flood source. The author, a Dingir named Nabu, a name later absorbed into Mesopotamian mythology, described the internal conflict among the Anunnaki hierarchy. Nabu wrote with a detached yet palpable weariness about the ethical horror of their mission. He described the Earth as a beautiful, thriving planet, which they were systematically stripping for their necessary resource, gold, crucial for shielding Nibiru's atmosphere. The creation of humanity was, to Nabu, an unnecessary violation, a brutal shortcut by the faction led by Enlil, designed only to expedite the extraction process. Vance paused, zooming in on the script that detailed Nabu's personal crisis. The script described a philosophical schism. Nabu and his followers believed that if they were to leave humanity, they should leave them with dignity and the tools for self-governance. Enlil's faction demanded total ignorance and continued servitude. This was the true meaning of the fallen angels. Not beings who betrayed God, but beings who betrayed their own mission parameters, offering forbidden technologies and knowledge to the burgeoning human race out of a sense of deep, cosmic guilt. They taught early humans agriculture, astronomy, and metallurgy, the very foundations of Sumerian civilization, in defiance of the tyrannical Anunnaki regime. Vance realized this framed the biblical Genesis story perfectly. The Lord, the demanding, jealous figure who punishes disobedience, was Enlil, the rigid overseer. The serpent, who brought knowledge, was Nabu, or his cohort, the moral dissenters who risked everything to grant humanity its intellectual birthright. The entire divine narrative was a sanitized, flattened retelling of a complex extraterrestrial industrial dispute. He felt an overwhelming rush of indignation, not for the church, but for humanity. For millennia, our spiritual aspiration had been defined by a narrative of original sin, guilt, and servitude, when the reality was a history of noble defiance against alien overlords. Next, Vance turned his attention to the clay ledger. This was the most overtly scientific and technological document. It was a cartographic and logistical guide. The precision was breathtaking. The tablets outlined resource-rich zones across the globe, including deposits in ancient Africa and the Andes, suggesting the Annunaki operation was far more global than Sumerian texts alone imply. The ledger included diagrams of complex machinery, seemingly related to atmospheric processing and deep mine excavation. Vance, though not an engineer, recognized schematics that bore a chilling resemblance to highly theoretical modern particle accelerators and advanced propulsion systems. But the most disturbing aspect was the map of the sky. It plotted planetary orbits with meticulous accuracy, including the gravitational influence of a massive, distant object, unquestionably Nibiru, the hypothesized planet or large celestial body on an elliptical long-period orbit that brought it into the inner solar system every few thousand years. The ledger didn't just mention Nibiru, it provided orbital mechanics that, if true, could be verified by modern astrophysics. This was empirical proof, not faith, not myth, but physics, geology, and astronomy. The Vatican held the astrophysics of an alien world. Vance was halfway through documenting the last section of the clay ledger when his peripheral sensor, a small device he had placed near the door, registered movement, a slow, deliberate approach. Cesare, the night watchman, was returning early from his break. A wave of icy adrenaline washed over Vance. He checked his watch. 1:24 a.m. He had 6 minutes before his supposed safety margin expired. Cesare was known for his rigid adherence to routine, never deviating. This early return was a massive deviation. Had Bellini anticipated this vulnerability? Had Antonio been compromised? Vance moved instantly, stuffing the equipment into his belt and coveralls, his heart pounding against his ribs. He had successfully documented the most critical, damning sections of all 3 texts, but he needed to return the room to its pristine state. He quickly wiped down the plexiglass surfaces, ensured the texts were positioned exactly as he had found them, and gathered the minuscule equipment. He moved to the door, his breath held tight in his chest. The footsteps stopped directly outside the annex door. Vance froze, pressed against the inner wall of the reading room, listening. If you are still with us, deeply absorbed in this investigation into the Vatican's secrets, it's a clear sign this subject matter resonates with you. Strengthen this content. Like the video now and send it to someone who needs to see this. Cesare didn't enter the annex. Instead, Vance heard a low, metallic scraping sound, followed by the distinctive clack of a padlock being secured. Cesare was not checking the room. He was locking the entire annex. This was not standard procedure. The annex was only locked down at 6 a.m. after the morning shift arrived. Vance heard Cesare humming a quiet, off-key Italian folk tune as his footsteps retreated down the corridor, fading into the immense silence of the archives. Vance was locked in. Antonio's calculated 2-hour window had been violently truncated. The external magnetic lock, which Antonio had bypassed to get Vance in, was now useless. Vance was trapped within a locked security zone, and the sun would rise in less than 5 hours, bringing with it the arrival of the Cardinal and his security detail. Vance cautiously tried the reading room door. It was unlocked, Cesare had only locked the main external door of the annex. He was safe from immediate discovery within the room, but his exit path was sealed. The air conditioning hummed, the only sound accompanying his racing thoughts. He was caught in the trap, a mouse in the heart of the lion's den, holding the stolen history of humanity on micro SD cards hidden in his shoe. Vance pulled out the floor plans Antonio had provided. He needed to find a maintenance hatch, a ventilation shaft, or any egress point that would lead him away from the locked corridor. He knew that the moment he was discovered, the entire Vatican security system would descend upon him. The documents were safe, but if he was captured, the evidence would be seized and he would simply disappear into the church's formidable silence. He moved silently around the reading room, checking the walls. The room was modern, inserted into the ancient stone structure, suggesting a hollow space between the new walls and the original medieval perimeter. He spotted a slight discoloration near the floor, behind a large conservation cabinet, a metal plate secured by 4 large screws, disguised to blend with the grey baseboard. A maintenance access hatch. Vance needed to work fast and silently. He used a tiny multi-tool blade from his kit, carefully removing the screws, fighting the intense pressure of the air within the archives, which felt like it was physically resisting his efforts. The metallic screech of the unscrewing process, though muffled, sounded deafeningly loud in the oppressive silence. Finally, the last screw came free. He gently placed the screws and the metal plate on the floor. He shone his small pen light into the aperture. It was a narrow, dusty crawl space, perhaps 3 feet high, running between the floor of the annex and the ceiling of the lower level. A forgotten space used for running electrical conduits and HVAC ductwork. It smelled intensely of dust, ozone, and ancient stone. It was narrow, dangerous, and offered a chance. Vance slipped into the crawl space, pulling the maintenance panel shut behind him and replacing the screws with painstaking care. He didn't tighten them fully, just enough to hold the plate flush and disguise his entry. He was now moving through the hidden infrastructure of the Vatican. He crawled on his stomach, his clothing catching on dust-covered wiring, the low ceiling scraping against his back. The air was stagnant and difficult to breathe. He checked his map. The maintenance space ran perpendicular to the main corridors, heading toward the subterranean levels. If he followed the largest conduit line, he should emerge near the old heating plant, which had a seldom-used service exit opening onto a quiet side street outside the Vatican walls. It was a long, arduous route, fraught with peril, but it was the only one. As he crawled, Vance clutched the micro SD cards, the entirety of the Annunaki documentation, in his left hand. The historical fate of humanity was now compressed onto 2 tiny pieces of silicon, moving slowly and painfully through the dust and darkness beneath the most secure repository of knowledge on Earth. He was deep inside the Vatican's institutional body, a silent infection of truth traveling through its veins. The tension was not just physical, but psychological. He could feel the invisible network of security, the institutional gaze of Cardinal Bellini pressing down on him, trying to crush him into the silence of the stone. The crawl was an excruciating exercise in physical endurance and mental control. The air quality deteriorated rapidly. The dust was ancient, choking, filled with the microparticles of centuries of decaying vellum and marble. Vance had to move deliberately, pushing his body forward inch by inch, his headlamp casting a limited beam onto the thick cables and the rough, unfinished concrete ceiling above him. He focused on the map, translating the feeling of the conduits, a large, pulsing electrical line, a narrow cold water pipe, into directional signals. His mind, however, refused to remain strictly focused on the physical. The content of the documents he had just documented was too overwhelming. He mentally replayed the most technical sections of the clay ledger. The drawings of the Annunaki vessels. They weren't depicted as flying chariots or celestial beings riding clouds, but as metallic, pressurized craft utilizing specific electromagnetic shielding for atmospheric entry. The scale and precision of the drawings suggested an engineering manual, not mythological art. Vance realized that the most devastating secret was not the creation itself, but the motivation. The Annunaki were portrayed in the redacted texts not as omnipotent gods, but as advanced, desperate colonists facing an existential crisis on their homeworld. They were flawed, fractious, and entirely pragmatic. This humanizes the gods in a way that is lethal to religious control. If the creators were merely scientists and miners, then humanity's search for meaning and salvation must be internally generated, not externally granted. It eliminates the need for mediation by the church. Vance's knee scraped painfully against a protruding bolt. He stopped, wincing, and waited for the pain to subside, forcing himself to breathe deeply the dry, dusty air. He could hear, faintly, the low, distant hum of the Vatican's massive power infrastructure, the lifeblood of the city-state above him. He was approaching a junction point where the main HVAC duct turned sharply toward the basement levels. The space widened momentarily to accommodate the ductwork, allowing him to shift position slightly, leaning against the cold, rough stone wall. The documents had also provided a shocking new context for the Great Flood. The Codex Sefu detailed that the deluge was not a divine punishment for human wickedness, but a predictable, catastrophic side effect of Nibiru's gravitational passage near Earth, coupled with a deliberate decision by the Annunaki hierarchy, Enlil's faction, to not warn the majority of the human workforce. The flood was seen as a necessary cleansing, a way to cull the burgeoning, rebellious human population and reset the remaining resources. Only a few select groups, those favored by the dissenting Annunaki, like Nabu Enki, were warned and given the technology to survive. The Ark, described in the texts as a highly sophisticated, sealed, submersible vessel, not a wooden boat. This single revelation dismantles the concept of a benevolent, interventionist deity choosing a moral champion, Noah, and replaces it with a cold, ruthless alien resource manager protecting valuable assets. The Vatican had meticulously removed all reference to orbital mechanics and gravitational shifts from the early flood narratives it preserved, leaving only the simplified moral tale of punishment. Above, Cardinal Bellini was already realizing his catastrophic error. Cesare, the watchman, reporting his early perimeter check, mentioned an anomaly, a faint metallic scent near the reading annex, and the sensation that the magnetic lock was slightly resistant when he activated the midnight lockdown. Bellini, whose intuition for institutional risk was unparalleled, immediately ordered a full security review of the high-security annex, disregarding the scheduled audit timeframe. He knew instinctively that if there was a breach, it would be related to the ASAI texts. No other document held such destructive power. Bellini descended to the archives at 2 a.m., his face rigid with cold fury. He was flanked by two high-ranking members of the Swiss Guard and Father Antonio, who was forced to accompany him, masking his terror with professional obedience. When Bellini saw the main annex door securely padlocked, he felt a brief wave of relief. But the locksmith, immediately summoned, found the lock slightly forced, suggesting recent, unauthorized access before Cesare secured it. They entered the annex. The reading room was pristine. The three ancient texts lay silently on the table, seemingly untouched. Bellini examined the Codex Sefu with forensic intensity. "Are they secure, Father Antonio?" Bellini demanded, his voice dangerously low. Antonio, shaking internally, confirmed, "Yes, Your Eminence, they appear undisturbed." But Bellini was a master of observation. He looked at the baseboard behind the conservation cabinet. A shadow, a faint line where the dust had been disturbed, caught his eye. He knelt, ignoring the dust on his perfectly tailored cassock. He ran a perfectly manicured finger across the baseboard and then looked at the 4 screw heads on the maintenance panel cover. They were slightly misaligned, and the metal beneath them was subtly scarred, the sign of a recent tool use. Bellini stood up slowly, his expression a mask of chilling certainty. "He is still in the building," he stated, not to Antonio, but to the Swiss guards. "He didn't steal the documents. He copied them, and he is hiding in the infrastructure. Find the nearest service tunnel. Lock down the entire subterranean level. Do not allow him to reach the ventilation exhaust near the old heating plant." If this deep dive into conspiracy and institutional control keeps your focus glued to the screen, you are exactly where you need to be. Then strengthen this content, like the video now, and send it to someone who needs to see this. Vance, now nearly 50 feet down the electrical conduit route, heard a faint, distant, but undeniable sound. The deep, resonant tone of an internal security alert, followed by the muffled, urgent voices of men moving quickly through the lower levels. The sound traveled through the metal ductwork and the stone walls, vibrating the concrete beneath him. They knew. They hadn't found the documents missing, but they had found the breach. He accelerated his movement, ignoring the pain in his joints, the raw scrape of his ribs against the concrete. His objective was the old heating plant, located at the very edge of the Vatican's sovereign territory, near the exterior walls. The crawl space suddenly pitched downward sharply, following the descent of the main sewage lines toward the Tiber River. This section was damp, colder, and slick with condensate. Vance pulled himself forward using the thick cables. He reached a crucial structural support junction, a massive, vaulted space beneath the central courtyard of the Belvedere. The engineers who built the modern archives had preserved this section due to its structural significance. Shining his light into the wide, low vault, Vance realized where he was. He was directly above the foundations of the earliest structures on the Vatican Hill, predating even Constantine's Basilica. And in the rough-hewn early Roman stone, he saw an anomaly. Embedded deep into the foundation stones, at a height that suggested it was placed before the current floor was poured, was a large, monolithic block of dark, non-native stone. It was smooth, highly polished, and inscribed with repeating complex geometric patterns that Vance immediately recognized from a section of the clay ledger he had photographed. This was not Roman craftsmanship. This was a piece of Annunaki technology, or perhaps an artifact, integrated directly into the foundational structure of the site. Why? Vance theorized rapidly. Perhaps the Annunaki, or their dissenting Watcher faction, had established a communication or observational outpost on the Vatican Hill, long before it became the spiritual seat of the West. The Church, in its infinite pragmatism, had simply built its authority over the source of this power, concealing the alien foundation of its own existence. They were not merely suppressing a historical text, they were suppressing an active physical link to the ancient visitors. He pressed his ear against the cold, smooth alien stone. He heard nothing but the pounding of his own blood and the distant shouts of the Swiss guard searching the upper levels. But the physical proof, the cold, alien stone beneath the heart of the papacy, was an even greater confirmation than the photographic copies. Vance continued, energized by the discovery, toward the heating plant exhaust duct. He followed the increasing warmth of the pipes. He finally reached the terminus of the crawl space, a small, square opening leading into the cavernous, echoing space of the abandoned heating plant. The air here was hot, thick with the oily smell of old machinery and coal dust. He slipped out, landing silently on a pile of forgotten, coal-stained sacks. He was in a massive dark room, filled with the looming silhouettes of obsolete boilers and pipes. Across the room, bathed in a sliver of exterior light filtering through a barred window, was the service door leading to the street. He started toward the door, moving quickly but cautiously, weaving through the machinery. He was mere yards from freedom. Suddenly, a voice echoed from the shadows. "Stop right there, Professor Vance. You underestimate the reach of the shepherd." Cardinal Bellini stood near the service door, seemingly appearing from the shadows, impeccably dressed, illuminated briefly by the weak moonlight filtering through a high window. He was not carrying a weapon, but his presence was a far greater threat. He was flanked by the two heavily armed Swiss guards, their faces obscured by the shadows, but their rifles visibly glinting in the faint light. Vance was trapped. The great silence of the archives was broken by the hard reality of force. The silence that followed Bellini's command was heavier than the stone walls surrounding them. Vance stopped instantly, raising his hands slowly, his heart rate spiking, but his mind remaining clear. The micro SD cards, the proof of the Annunaki history, were still securely stowed. His immediate priority was not escape, but the preservation of the evidence. "Your Eminence," Vance said, allowing a tone of weary respect to enter his voice. "This is not a matter for the Swiss Guard. This is an academic matter." Bellini stepped forward slightly, revealing the cold, calculating precision in his gaze. He moved with the practiced authority of a man who believed his mandate was divinely sanctioned, even when executing the most pragmatic forms of censorship. "Academic?" Bellini scoffed, the word sounding alien in the cavernous, dusty plant. "You breached the sovereign territory of the Holy See, Professor. You desecrated records that are protected by international treaty and by divine mandate. You risked the stability of civilization for a few cheap photographs. You call this academic?" Vance lowered his hands slightly, focusing on Bellini, ignoring the lethal threat posed by the guards flanking the Cardinal. "I call it historical honesty, Cardinal. You call it forbidden knowledge because it dismantles your authority. The documents, the Codex Sefu, the Watcher's account, they prove that Genesis is a redacted industrial record, that humanity was genetically engineered by desperate alien miners, that the concept of original sin is merely an old manager's fear of a slave revolt. How does that truth justify 1700 years of absolute silence?" Bellini walked closer, stopping just outside the reach of the oppressive heat emanating from the defunct boilers. His voice was smooth, cultivated, and utterly devoid of spiritual warmth. He offered not a denial of the document's contents, but a ruthless justification for their concealment. "You see truth as liberating, Professor Vance. I see it as a contagion. Imagine the reality. You release these photos. The global population learns that their inherent dignity is a genetic accident, their spiritual yearning a byproduct of alien tinkering. What follows? Anarchy, nihilism. If there is no divine creator, there is no divine law. If we are merely Lulu Amelu, then every established legal, moral, and governmental framework collapses." Bellini spread his hands in a gesture of weary, necessary burden. "The Church provides the essential illusion. We provide the meaning that the universe, in its cold, pragmatic truth, refuses to offer. The Anunnaki were a historical reality, yes, but they were primitive in their lack of ethical foresight. They left the tools for chaos. We, the Church, perfected the tools for order. We took the alien narrative, baptized it, and gave humanity a fighting chance at stability and shared moral purpose. We did not suppress history. We saved the future from it." Vance shook his head, a gesture of profound disappointment. "You speak of order, Cardinal, but you mean control. You are afraid of the knowledge of the Dingir because it empowers the individual to look beyond your gilded walls. The price of your order is eternal spiritual childhood for 7 billion people." The confrontation reached its necessary apex. Bellini had no interest in philosophical debate. He only needed the evidence. "Give me the recording device, Professor, and your life will be spared. You will be quietly deported, and your career will simply evaporate. You will be remembered as a conspiracy theorist who suffered a mental break." "And if I refuse?" Vance challenged, tightening his stance, calculating his distance to the exit and the nearest cover. "Then you will be processed as an unprecedented security threat," Bellini said, his voice hardening. The security protocols here are not subject to standard civil law. You will be interred, and your fate will be known only to the 4 cardinals of the commission. Vance knew he couldn't fight the guards. He had to ensure the evidence survived. He made a sudden, desperate movement, not toward the exit, but toward the closest boiler, pretending to make a break for the machinery. The guards reacted instantly, raising their rifles and shouting in Swiss German. As they focused their attention on his body, Vance executed his desperate strategy. He reached into his shoe, pulled out the 2 micro-SD cards, and with a silent, quick movement, he hurled them toward a high, narrow, and nearly inaccessible ventilation grate located far above the boiler pipes. The small plastic cards disappeared into the shadows of the machinery, hitting the metal grate with a faint, almost inaudible click. Bellini watched the movement, his face registering a flash of pure, undisguised rage. "Retrieve them!" he roared at the guards. The guards rushed toward the boiler area. Vance, utilizing the brief distraction, moved quickly away from Bellini toward the exit door, knowing his chance was infinitesimally small. Bellini, fueled by institutional desperation, grabbed a heavy antique fire extinguisher from the wall and swung it, missing Vance's head by inches, the metal canister scraping the stone wall. Vance reached the door, fumbling with the heavy bolt. One of the guards, having realized the small size of the evidence, abandoned the search and fired a warning shot. A controlled burst of suppressed air that slammed into the metal of the boiler next to Vance's head with a deafening crack. The smell of burnt powder immediately filling the stale air. Vance pushed the heavy door open, stumbled out into the cold Roman night, and slammed the steel door shut behind him. He didn't wait to hear if they followed. He ran, disappearing instantly into the dark, narrow alleyway outside the Vatican's walls. Inside the heating plant, Bellini watched the door slam shut, his chest heaving with frustrated anger. He turned to the guards, his calm facade finally shattered. "The cards! Find them now! Scour this plant! If that evidence leaves this city, the repercussions will be catastrophic." The guards, using their flashlights, began the frantic, detailed search of the enormous, complex machinery. Bellini turned to Antonio, who stood pale and shivering near the entrance. "And, Father Antonio," the cardinal said, his voice returning to its chilling calm, "you seemed entirely too unsurprised by the professor's actions. Your service to the Historical Commission is hereby terminated. You will be sent immediately to the Trappist monastery in Umbria. You will live the rest of your life in silence and solitude. Pray that silence can cleanse the treason in your soul. Go." Antonio, broken by the betrayal of his own institution, simply nodded, his eyes vacant, and walked out of the plant, heading toward a new life defined by penance and geographical isolation. The Vatican had efficiently neutralized its internal threat. Vance ran several blocks before slowing, his body aching, his lungs burning from the dusty air of the crawl space. He found a dark bus stop, blending in with the few early morning commuters. He was out, he was free, but the evidence was still hanging precariously within the defunct heating plant. He knew he couldn't return. The Vatican would have the entire area saturated with surveillance and plainclothes security within the hour. He needed a plan, and fast. He had successfully copied the greatest secret of human history, only to leave the evidence suspended 20 feet above a dusty floor, secured by a metal grate. He was now a fugitive, targeted by the most formidable historical intelligence operation on the planet. The high-resolution photographic files were sitting, waiting in the belly of the beast. Vance retreated to his safe house, the apartment near Piazza Cavour. He immediately destroyed the laptop he had used for the deep search queries and all the hard copy maps and notes. He felt the cold, creeping realization that the Vatican's response would not be a standard police investigation, but a total, institutional suppression effort targeting his life, reputation, and freedom. He had to assume his communications were compromised, his bank accounts monitored, and every port of exit watched. He was Elias Vance, the American academic on paper. Now he was Elias Vance, the historical terrorist, in the Vatican's files. He found a secure connection, a payphone in a deserted corner of the Trastevere district, and made a single, desperate call to his most trusted colleague in the United States, Professor Lena Sorensen, a specialist in comparative mythology at Columbia University. Lena was shocked, but listened with quiet professionalism as Vance delivered a highly cryptic, condensed version of events. "Lena, I have evidence that fundamentally changes the origin narrative. It's stored on micro SD cards, hidden in the Vatican heating plant, near the old coal boilers, behind a high metal grate. I need you to find a retrieval specialist, someone clean, discreet, and utterly unaffiliated with me, and you must do this without speaking my name on any traceable device." Lena, a pragmatic, fiercely intelligent woman, understood the gravity in Vance's strained voice. She didn't question the improbable nature of his story. She recognized the desperation of a man who had seen the abyss. She was uniquely suited for this task. Her academic field, while mainstream, was deeply intertwined with the fringe theories of early civilization, and she had contacts in various specialized fields, including high-risk artifact recovery. Lena mobilized a small trusted team in New York. She chose Leo, a former CIA asset turned private security consultant, specializing in non-conventional retrieval in complex urban environments. Leo was expensive, meticulous, and entirely amoral, the perfect neutral party. He didn't care about the Annunaki, he cared about the contract. The plan was complex and time-sensitive. The Vatican search team, led by Bellini, would eventually find the cards. They would be searching every inch of the floor, the machinery, and the low-level maintenance access points. They wouldn't immediately look 20 feet up, behind a dusty, decades-old ventilation grate. While Lena prepared the retrieval operation, Vance spent his time in hiding, reflecting on the broader implications of the documents he had seen. The Annunaki secret was not just a theological problem, it was a geopolitical crisis. The technical specifications found in the clay ledger suggested a level of material science that made modern fusion power look like a child's toy. If those records were released, they would trigger a global technological arms race unlike any seen before. Every major power, the US, China, Russia, would suddenly view the Vatican not as a spiritual authority, but as a repository of alien super technology. Vance realized that Bellini's justification for concealment, though cynical, wasn't entirely wrong on the geopolitical threat level. The knowledge was inherently destabilizing. The question was, who deserved to make the decision to suppress it? A self-appointed committee of cardinals or the global scientific community? If this continuous escalation of the historical threat has you questioning the very foundations of reality, your curiosity is driving you forward. Then strengthen this content, like the video now, and send it to someone who needs to see this. 3 days later, Leo arrived in Rome, masquerading as a German industrial safety inspector hired to review the decommissioned Vatican heating plant's asbestos risk. He was armed not with weapons, but with climbing gear, high-powered magnets, and official-looking clipboards. The heating plant, Vance had correctly surmised, was now under heavy but subtle surveillance. Bellini's team was searching internally, while external security monitored for Vance's return. Leo, operating under the guise of an audit, spent the first day methodically mapping the entire interior of the plant, slowly gaining the trust of the bored, low-level security detail posted at the entrance. He spoke German loudly, used impenetrable industrial jargon, and complained incessantly about European safety standards. On the second night, utilizing a planned power fluctuation that was part of his inspection, Leo managed to create a 30-minute window of reduced visibility near the central boiler unit. He quickly deployed a specialized drone, a miniature silent quadcopter used for confined space inspection, equipped with high-powered retrieval magnets. The air inside the plant was thick with dust and the stale smell of oil. Leo maneuvered the tiny drone toward the ventilation grate, the light of its miniature camera cutting through the gloom. The interior of the grate was clogged with dust and cobwebs, but then the drone's light caught the faint gleam of non-reflective plastic, the micro SD cards, resting precariously on a thin lip of metal just inside the opening. Leo carefully guided the drone, positioning the magnetic retrieval head. The first card snapped against the magnet. He gently retrieved it. Then the second. Success was achieved in absolute silence, the only sound the faint whirring of the drone's rotors. Leo retrieved the drone and the cards, sealed them in a heavily shielded, triple-encrypted hard case, and calmly walked out of the plant, nodding curtly to the security guard, who was playing solitaire on his tablet. The Vatican's greatest secret had just been transferred from the custody of the Church to the hands of a mercenary. Leo immediately departed Rome, utilizing a complex series of trains and commercial flights designed to neutralize electronic tracking. 48 hours later, in a sterile, secure laboratory basement in New York, Lena presented Vance with the hard case. Vance opened the case, retrieving the two tiny micro SD cards. After days of tension and terror, the culmination was anticlimactic, just two pieces of black silicon. Yet they represented the bomb that could detonate civilization. Vance connected the cards to a dedicated offline server. The files opened instantly. Thousands of high-resolution images, digitized cuneiform, Syriac text, and cartographic diagrams. The Codex Sephu, the clay ledger, and the Watcher's account, meticulously catalogued and verified. The forbidden knowledge was finally out. Vance and Lena spent the next weeks in isolation, verifying the translations and cross-referencing the technical data. The sheer volume of detail confirmed their deepest fears and wildest theories. But one section of the clay ledger offered a terrifying new insight: the true purpose of the gold. It wasn't just for atmospheric shielding on Nibiru. The documents revealed that the Annunnaki's gold mining was tied to a larger pan-galactic defense mechanism. They were storing the energy-dense gold in strategic locations, anticipating a future interstellar conflict with a rival, highly aggressive alien species. Earth was not just a mine, it was a refueling station and a storage depot for a much larger cosmic war. And humanity, the engineered workforce, was simply a resource management tool left behind, expected to decay into silence until the Anunnaki returned, or until they needed the resources again. The Vatican knew this, and the Church's entire history of preparation for the end times took on a horrifying new meaning. The Church was not preparing for the return of Christ, but for the return of the Dingir, the alien overlords, and the potential outbreak of a cosmic conflict on Earth's soil. Vance felt the crushing weight of responsibility. Releasing this information would cause chaos, but concealing it meant participating in the great lie that underpinned global civilization. The knowledge was too powerful, too dangerous for a single individual to hold. He looked at Lena, the gravity of their situation reflected in her weary eyes. "We have the truth, Lena, but what happens when we pull the trigger? We don't just destroy the Church, we destroy the framework of meaning for every person on Earth." They needed to find a way to disclose the information that would not instantly lead to panic and geopolitical warfare, a challenge that seemed impossible given the nature of the secret. The fate of humanity, Vance realized, rested on how they presented the story of its creation. The photographic evidence of the ASAI texts was indisputable, yet Vance and Lena knew that in the court of public opinion, the Vatican would deploy its considerable historical and political machinery to discredit the copies as sophisticated forgeries. They needed something physical, something empirical, that could not be dismissed as text manipulation. They returned to the notes on the clay ledger. The ledger included not only cartography, but also an inventory of Anunnaki technology left behind. One entry, marked "The Generator of Eridu," referred to a self-sustaining power source that was used to run the original genetic engineering facility. The ledger marked its current location not in Sumer, but in a subterranean cavity beneath a place of later worship, with highly specific coordinates. Vance cross-referenced the coordinates with modern GPS data overlaid on ancient Roman maps. The coordinates pointed directly beneath the high altar of St. Peter's Basilica, directly beneath the traditional burial site of St. Peter. This was the ultimate insult. The holiest site in Catholicism, the very symbol of papal authority, was built over a discarded piece of alien machinery. The Vatican didn't just suppress the history, they consecrated the machine itself, turning it into the physical foundation of their spiritual power. The area beneath St. Peter's is a dizzying maze of crypts, necropolises, the ancient Roman city of the dead, and structural foundations dating back to the Neronian era. Access to the deepest levels is almost entirely restricted, requiring special permission from the fabric of St. Peter's, the powerful ancient body responsible for maintaining the basilica. Vance and Lena hypothesized that the generator of Eridu was likely not an active power source anymore, but a large non-terrestrial artifact that the early church fathers recognized as intrinsically powerful, perhaps resonating with low-level electromagnetic energy or simply possessing an astonishing, non-degradable material composition. They needed proof that this artifact existed and that the church was actively monitoring it. Lena utilized her academic network to approach an elderly, retired Italian architectural historian, Dr. Emilio Rossi, who had worked extensively on the foundational maintenance of the basilica in the 1970s. Rossi was notoriously obsessed with the structural anomalies beneath the basilica, particularly an inexplicably high-energy reading in the sublevel near the niche of the pallia. Rossi, disillusioned with the institutional corruption he had witnessed, confirmed that an area directly below the high altar was permanently sealed with modern reinforced concrete. A structural correction, he was told, but the correction was based on a cavity that did not exist in the original 17th century blueprints. Rossi provided Lena with highly technical survey notes from the 1970s, which showed anomalous density readings in the sealed area, far exceeding the density of marble, granite, or even steel alloys. The density signature matched the known material composition of certain metallic fragments found in early Sumerian digs, fragments often dismissed as meteoric iron, but now, through the lens of the clay ledger, revealed as Annunaki-grade materials. If you are still mentally dissecting the architectural and historical layers of this revelation, you are demonstrating the intellectual resilience needed for this kind of truth. Then, strengthen this content. Like the video now and send it to someone who needs to see this. Back in Rome, Cardinal Bellini, having failed to retrieve the micro SD cards, shifted his strategy to absolute preemptive demolition. He recognized that Vance would eventually attempt to publish. Bellini initiated a quiet but devastating smear campaign. Through strategic leaks to compliant academic journals and influential news outlets, Vance was painted as a disgraced historian suffering from severe delusions, citing fabricated internal reports of erratic behavior and financial impropriety. His tenure was revoked, his access to university libraries immediately cut off, and his name was quietly placed on international watch lists, not for criminal activity, but for severe psychological instability. The goal was simple: ensure that when Vance published his findings, no reputable institution or outlet would touch the story, labeling it the rantings of a paranoid academic who had finally cracked under the pressure of the historical fringe. Vance watched powerless as his life's work and reputation were systematically dismantled. He understood the effectiveness of the attack. Bellini was not fighting the evidence, he was fighting the credibility of the messenger. Vance and Lena, working in their isolated New York bunker, refined their analysis of the Watcher's account. Nabu and his dissenting Annunaki faction, the Fallen Angels, had left behind more than knowledge. They had left a mechanism of assistance. The texts detailed a sophisticated guidance system, potentially tied to the generator of Eridu beneath the basilica, designed to subtly influence human development along paths of greater complexity, preventing total societal collapse that would destroy the gold mining infrastructure. They realized that perhaps the inspiration for many great human leaps, the sudden surge in mathematics in classical Greece, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, were not purely internal human achievements, but subtle, nudged directives from the hidden system, ensuring humanity remained capable but controlled. This was the chilling realization. The Anunnaki were still, in a subtle technological sense, managing their farm. Vance realized that he could not release the information through conventional channels. It had to be through a source that was already outside the jurisdiction of Vatican influence and beyond the reach of institutional censorship, a platform that valued intellectual freedom over established authority. They decided to partner with an independent, highly respected documentary filmmaker and investigative journalist known for tackling sensitive geopolitical subjects and present the evidence as part of a feature-length documentary. This format would allow them to control the narrative, present the complexity of the theological justification for suppression, Bellini's argument, and, most importantly, layer the visual evidence, the photographic copies, with expert analysis and the undeniable objective proof of the non-terrestrial artifact beneath St. Peter's. Their goal was not to start a panic, but to start a global, informed conversation about human origins and the nature of belief. They decided to name their project the Genesis Deception. For 6 months, Vance and Lena worked in complete secrecy, feeding the authenticated documents to the filmmaker in measured, verifiable doses. They secured corroborating testimony from retired scientists and linguists who, like Father Ricci, had encountered the fringe of this knowledge and chosen to remain silent out of fear. The preparation itself was a silent war against the Vatican's influence. Every potential source was vetted for Bellini's counterintelligence. Every fact was triple-checked. They knew that the moment the documentary trailer dropped, the full crushing weight of the Church's retaliation would fall upon them. Vance was no longer focused on escape or revenge. His focus was entirely on the survival of the truth. He was the messenger, and he knew that messengers are often sacrificed. But the Anunnaki knowledge, once digitized, encrypted, and distributed across multiple secure servers globally, could not be erased. The ghost files were now an unkillable global reality. The documentary, The Genesis Deception, was scheduled for a staggered global online premiere, specifically avoiding traditional media distribution channels controlled by major conglomerates often susceptible to external pressure. 24 hours before the launch, Vance received an untraceable encrypted message delivered via a highly complex PGP chain. The message was concise, elegant, and chillingly clear. It was from Cardinal Bellini. Professor Vance, I concede that you succeeded in retrieving your stolen data, a temporary victory of espionage, nothing more. But you underestimate the resilience of faith. The truth you hold will not dismantle belief. It will merely refine it. And the chaos you seek to unleash will consume you first. I offer you one final opportunity. Cease the publication, and we will allow you to live out your remaining days in quiet obscurity. Proceed, and we will ensure that your legacy is defined by lunacy and failure. Vance read the message in the sterile confines of the production studio. He looked out the window at the distant, glittering skyline of New York, a city built on human aspiration and scientific ambition, a civilization that, according to the documents, was born from a lab on the Mesopotamian plain. He understood Bellini's final move, a psychological assault designed to trigger doubt and fear. Bellini was fighting the war on the intellectual battlefield, knowing he could no longer fight on the physical one. Vance did not reply. He simply deleted the message and gave the final decisive command, "Go live." The premiere of the Genesis deception was a digital earthquake. The initial response was predictable. Immediate dismissal from mainstream theology, aggressive denial from the Vatican, and a rapid, dismissive condemnation from established history departments globally, all echoing the smear campaign Bellini had orchestrated against Vance. But the documentation was too precise. The photographic copies of the Codex Sephu and the clay ledger contained technical and linguistic detail that defied simple forgery. Independent linguists, intrigued by the structure and content of the texts, began to verify the complexity of the Syriac translations, noting the disturbing homogeneity with known Sumerian mythology. The most damaging piece of evidence was the detailed analysis of the structural anomaly beneath St. Peter's Basilica. Vance and Lina released the 1970s structural density surveys, correlating the unusual, high-density artifact signature with the Annunaki material science described in the ledger. This shifted the focus from a historical argument to a physical objective investigation. It was one thing to deny a scroll. It was another to deny the existence of a massive non-terrestrial object embedded in the foundation of the world's most famous church. The Vatican found itself in an unprecedented crisis. Journalists descended on Rome, demanding access to the basilica's substructure, demanding answers about the structural anomalies. The pressure was not coming from the faithful, who largely rejected the documentary, but from the geopolitical and scientific community. Governments, alarmed by the potential for untapped alien technology, began exerting diplomatic pressure on the Holy See. Cardinal Bellini and the Historical Commission launched a full-scale counter-documentary effort, attempting to recontextualize the ASAI texts as Gnostic heresy that had been correctly identified and isolated by early church fathers. But the technological detail, the orbital mechanics, the genetic schematics, was too advanced to be dismissed as 5th-century theological metaphor. The core of the Annunaki secret was revealed. Humanity was a controlled experiment, a means to an alien end. As the world reeled, Vance released the final, most haunting piece of evidence, the concluding segment of the Watcher's account. Nabu, the dissenting Annunaki, had warned humanity that the Dingir would inevitably return. Not because they cared about their creation, but because Nibiru's periodic proximity to Earth was a consistent feature of the solar system, and the vast stores of gold, the resource depot beneath the surface, would need replenishing or worse, weaponizing for the anticipated galactic war. The text concluded with a chilling promise. The Watchers, Nabu's faction, had left behind an esoteric warning woven into human cultural memory, specifically in the symbolism of the ancient mystery religions and the esoteric Gnostic sects. This warning was designed to be understood only when human science reached a specific level of technological sophistication, a level that Vance realized was rapidly approaching in the 21st century. The warning detailed the method of the Annunnaki's return, not in fire and glory, but through subtle gravitational manipulation and the activation of dormant technology left on Earth. The generator of Eridu beneath St. Peter's was not just an artifact. It was likely a beacon, or perhaps a component of the guidance system for the returning celestial body. Vance and Lina looked at the data, their fear transcending historical curiosity. The revelation of the Anunnaki was not the end of the story. It was the prologue to a planetary crisis. The Vatican had been sitting on a countdown clock. The question left hanging in the air for the global audience was devastating. If the Anunnaki return, will they find a free humanity, or their obedient, genetically engineered workforce, primed for service by millennia of institutional control? The documentary ended not with answers, but with a terrifying, undeniable urgency. The ancient history of the Anunnaki was suddenly, terrifyingly, the future of human survival. The stage was set for the next chapter. If this content has cracked open your mind to the deep layers of history and conspiracy, comment below, "I reached the end." This helps us understand who is truly seeking knowledge beyond the surface. Like the video, subscribe now to the channel and hit that notification bell, because the next episodes will go even deeper into the Watcher's warning and the coming return. And don't leave without clicking the next video. It is the continuation of this vital journey. Elias Vance, now a global pariah, lived permanently underground, protected by Lena and her security team. His name was synonymous with historical upheaval. He had shattered the fundamental illusion of the Western world. He had exposed the Vatican not as the seat of divine authority, but as the longest-running security firm for an extraterrestrial real estate project. The challenge now was not exposure, but preparation. Vance knew the full Anunnaki story was only just beginning, and the evidence he had copied was merely the map to a much larger cosmological threat. The secrets of the Vatican were out, but the secrets of the cosmos were only just being revealed.